Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm Richard Reinsch. Today we're talking with James Patterson about his new book, Religion in the Public Square, Sheen, King, Falwell. James Patterson teaches politics at Ave Maria University, and I'm delighted to say he is a frequent contributor to Law and Liberty. James, glad to have you on the program.
It's good to be with you, Richard.
So congratulations on your new book, just out with Pen Press. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it this week and preparing for this interview. Before we get to that, though, James, maybe introduce yourself more to our audience. You've been writing some for Law and Liberty. You teach at Ave Maria. Located in South Florida, a new university outside of Naples, Florida, I'm told. I've never been there. I've been to Naples, not to your university. I need to come sometime. If you follow James Patterson on social media, you can frequently be treated to scenes from his family running across the state of Florida in the family auto, I should say motoring, as they escape oncoming hurricanes, with great commentary from James about their adventures.
Oh, well, yes, it's that's the next book project. It's the travel log from Irma and another such events.
But you really make it fun. One was about the great thing about fleeing a hurricane in Florida is all the great scenery. But it was you surrounded by parking lots.
That's right. When fleeing Irma, we drove an unbroken trip west. And most of the time, when I had time to take pictures, it was in parking lots of Paneras, where my daughter at one point is delusional in one of the photographs. And, I just was very proud of her for holding it together, considering she had she had no expectation that afternoon that she was just going to get trucked to Texas.
Well, now also Ave Maria, I'm told, a new university built on or near a swamp, frequently encountering wildlife, I'm told, is a part of the job description at Ave Maria.
That's correct. I live in a neighborhood where there's considerable controversy over the placement of garbage cans too late at night or overnight, and as a result, the bears come to our neighborhood relatively frequently, and now during the day, so they just kind of come up and down the street.
But they're fun black bears, right?
These are just they're very sweet. No, I'm just kidding. They're black bears, but it's terrifying when you see someone's very large dog has apparently escaped, and then you're like, oh no, that's
just a bear.
That's a bear. With the sheer volume of small children at this very Catholic university, it's funny, but then it gets kind of scary because you don't want the kids to come running outside and to pet the dog. Right?
Yeah. So. Yeah, and that's not even talking about the alligators and rattlesnakes. Well, that's good to know.
Oh, yeah.
Now you do find time to write. You've written this book, Religion in the Public Square. That title, though, leaves a lot of questions. What's going on in this book?
Mm-hmm. So, Religion in the Public Square, Sheen, King, Falwell, is about three cases in which we find public policy influenced by major religious leaders. The cases are listed in the title, soon to be Blessed Fulton Sheen, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Reverend Jerry Falwell. The public square here is understood in many cases as a kind of media space, although all three figures obviously also engaged in real public square debates, such as Sheen giving public addresses, King marching through Birmingham, and Falwell giving public addresses in such places as Cambridge, Massachusetts. Right, so there's kind of a media story in that public square. And the funny thing about those stories is that they're all very different. Fulton Sheen was able to be ahead of the curve when it came to mass media. King did not have access to a lot of media.
Maybe a lot of our listeners have heard the name Fulton Sheen, but maybe place him for us and give us some context. Maybe we can do that a little bit more in depth in the interview. I did want to ask you, though, Religion in the Public Square. Before we talk about these three figures, you have a wonderful chapter introducing the the both prevalent and difficult and complicated presence of religion in American political life and in our public philosophy. And you introduce us to Alexis de Tocqueville and the way he writes about religion. And you quote his famous phrase, the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty. Maybe talk about that.
Yeah, it's true. I should start there. So Alexis de Tocqueville observed that in America, unlike in France, the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty were friends and formed a kind of common religious dogma that served as a political foundation for public discourse, which isn't to say that American public discourse was always very pious or even necessarily very ethical, but at least it had a kind of sense of limits that were placed on a common understanding of the human person, the nature and purpose of government, and the obligations that individuals had to each other in their communities and to their broader political organizations. And the achievement of this alliance was the result of the disestablishment of churches from the federal government, and in some cases, most cases at the time, but not all of them, from the state government. And what this enabled was the congregations and clergy to be dedicated to their own spiritual welfare. The clergy were no longer dependent on the state for the collection of tithes or the support of personages and what have you. And the people were no longer scandalized by corrupt relationships between state and church actors. And so the state was then free to kind of pursue whatever ends it was responsible for, whether at the national level that be setting sort of trade policy, or at the state level that be managing contracts or setting regulations on businesses, building bridges and the like. So this kind of relationship was very profitable for the United States in terms of producing as much political liberty for Republican government as possible, as well as empowering the faith of the various people to be lived relatively unmolested. And the entire outcome was in quite contrast to the way things were going in France at the time.
So maybe we'll think about that, the disestablishment being a part of American thinking, although certain states had established churches. I think the last one was 1833. Mm-hmm. Thinking about that,
right.
Though, how does religion shape democracy in America? And how does democracy in America end up shaping religion in America?
So religion becomes a kind of common language that people use in order to speak to each other about all things in their lives, especially with respect to politics. And this need for a common dogma is one that Tocqueville routinely observed. It's an example from a book that I relied on by Cahan, Tocqueville, Democracy and Religion, out in Oxford a couple years ago. Has this great example of dogma being something like deciding on what colors of light mean when you enter an intersection. If individuals try to determine what the light colors mean on their own, then you have a lot of traffic accidents because some people think red means go, some people think yellow means go, and some people think green means go. And what religion does is it sets what those things really are in our public discourse. And it also orients individuals away from material life and teaching those dogmas. So the Christian church dedicates individuals to pursuing a kind of spiritual happiness. It kind of places a secondary importance on material happiness, and Tocqueville's extremely concerned about this because American democracy shows sort of on the scene. Sort of on the limit, there are these examples of a kind of hunger for material well-being. And so religion is very necessary to prevent people from succumbing to temptations to pursuing sort of unvarnished wealth. One final thing is that religion provides a kind of a kind of softening of the mores. It provides a kind of way of discourse that is sort of productive of better manners among individuals in their daily lives, instead of a kind of coarseness that emerges. And this is partly because religion brings people out of the home and civilizes them to engage in ordinary life, which is absolutely essential if you're going to have a free people engaging in self-government. So there's a lot that religion does for democracy. As for what democracy does to religion, the general idea is that it sort of provides for the defense of the individual conscience. And in this respect, there's kind of a fear that if there's the individual conscience is left on its own, then it may not be properly formed to pursue the spiritual goals of whichever church denomination you belong to. But in fact, what that means is that churches then have the liberty to go out and seek people and bring them into the faith. So there's actually a lot of good that democracy does merely by getting out of the way of the good administration of clergy.
So this spirit of religion and spirit of liberty, Tocqueville says, and you talk about this in your book, religion and liberty aren't seen at loggerheads in the American tradition, although we can talk about how that's changed now. Maybe we'll do that later in the interview.
Yeah.
But the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty reinforce one another.
That's right. That's right. Provided that the institutions are kept in the kind of balance that he finds them in. Okay. And it was a rather spectacular sort of experience of no clergy in America appearing to want to belong to government. That's like the thing that really startles Tocqueville especially when he's talking to the Catholic priest.
Yeah. Now, thinking about, so you write about sort of the progression, or say progression, I guess we can use that term, Protestant hegemony to Judeo-Christian consensus. So the Protestant hegemony being America, part of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, we can talk about the things that challenge that. And you write about Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who sort of, the Protestant hegemony was not open to Jews and not open to Catholics. Sheen sort of opens that up. But then also the Judeo-Christian consensus, you argue, as it will receive another enlargement under Martin Luther King Jr., will then close. Curiously, you argue it's either caused or correlated with Reverend Jerry Falwell. And so maybe we can just move through that. But thinking about Archbishop Fulton Sheen, how does he challenge the Protestant hegemony, and what does he bring?
So just to set some terms, Protestant hegemony is a term that I get from Daryl Hart. It refers to the period in which the United States experienced mass evangelization in the United States, known as the Second Great Awakening during the 1830s. In fact, part of what was so impressed Tocqueville about American religiosity was that he was here when that was going on, and could very easily credit the fact that there was no established church as one of the key institutional factors that led to this evangelization. And hegemony really continued through the Civil War into the beginning of the 20th century, and that hegemony expressed itself frequently when it came up against groups it didn't like. So one of the examples of this would be, essentially the harrowing of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or what we call Mormons, from northern New York all the way out to the Canyonlands. We forget that we actually declared war on Mormons for a while, right? 1858, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so
an extermination order was issued against the Mormons, I think.
Yeah, I mean it's.
By a governor,
I guess there was a lot going on in 1858, so there's a lot of headlines that we have to get. Yeah. But at the same time that's going on, you have a lot of nativist opposition to Catholics, especially Irish Catholics, who are perceived as foreign agents who would undermine Republican liberty rooted in the English Reformation. And that language was very common and frequently used for political purposes. So I kind of told this nice story from Tocqueville earlier. I don't mean to leave out these rather unpleasant historical moments. And So Protestant hegemony is more or less in place until it itself experiences a kind of internal rift that sends two sides of Protestantism in America in two different directions. It sort of begins with the advancement of historical criticism of the Bible that became known as modern or modernist or liberal Protestantism. And then fundamentalists, people who wanted to insist on traditional Protestant dogmas, differed over the direction that this theology was taking the different Protestant denominations. And so you have that famous split that occurs over a period of 10 years between what eventually called the fundamentalists and the mainline or liberal Protestants. And once the fundamentalists go their separate way, starting their own institutions, in some cases denominations, that left mainline Protestants able to reach out to other organizations that maybe they shared cities with or they shared common interests with. A lot of this history is told in a book by Kevin Schultz called Tri-Faith America, which ends right around the same time that I'm picking up my cases. So I just wanted to say that's what Protestant hegemony means. And these folks, these mainline Protestants that reach out to Jews and Catholics during this period are doing so because of paramilitary violence by the Ku Klux Klan. So there's a real urgency to this in the 1920s. And the ironic outcome is no sooner do mainline Protestants begin this kind of outreach to American Catholics and Jews, is that the leadership of the Judeo-Christian consensus is immediately under contact. So one of the first people who really is able to marshal a kind of national audience that could describe themselves as Jews, Protestants, and Catholics was not a mainline Protestant minister, but rather Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen in the 1930s, who would later be, made a bishop in 1951. So what Sheen was able to accomplish was in two stages to sort of prove that American Catholics were patriots, that they loved their country. And to do that required both illustrating that the common enemy that Protestants had once identified, that is the Catholic Church, was actually a friend, and at the same time that there was an actual common enemy to all people of faith, and that enemy was communism. And so Sheen began this effort under direct instruction from Pope Pius XI. And for those of you who don't know, Fulton Sheen was from outside Peoria, Illinois, El Paso, Illinois, and from an Irish Catholic family, born in 1890, I forget the exact year, and was always kind of a star student. He ended up just finishing his graduate work at University of Louvain, where he received an agrégé degree of the highest honors. He was one of the most accomplished academic theologians ever in the history of the church up to that point. So when he took to the airwaves in 1930, he was bringing with him the kind of full force of this neo-Thomistic revival that Louvain had been leading, and was bringing it to, of all places, the living rooms of the American people.
So what did he?
With their radios on.
So what was his? we talk about religion in the public square. Your book. What did Sheen want to bring to the public square?
So it's no coincidence that when he was going to the public, it was 1930, because the Catholic Church in America was still smarting from the vociferous anti-Catholicism of the 1928 presidential debate, in which the first Catholic nominee, Al Smith, had run for president. And so Sheen saw that it was necessary for him to go on the air and explain Catholicism. He did so on a radio show called The Catholic Hour. And the argument that he made was that the common good in the United States was spiritual happiness. So everybody is pursuing some kind of spiritual good. And a necessary condition for that pursuit is political liberty. And for that, and for the establishment of political liberty, you had to revere the elements of the American regime that were most responsible for it. So he was adamant in sort of defending the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as instruments of liberty for the pursuit of spiritual happiness. And he called this Americanism, which is a fraught term in the history of American Catholicism. What's strange is that he went for that term. He could have chosen a lot of different terms. I got into this in the chapter. Americanism was both what the Protestant hegemony called the true message of the American Constitution, which repudiated Catholicism, and it was also a term that had been more or less condemned by Pope Leo the 13th in the practices of some churches in the United States. So Sheen goes right for this term, with absolutely no punishment. Instead, in tremendous support from the Vatican in the process of using it. The idea here is that when you look at the way that the church operates in America, it is constantly operating in a way that affirms the need for spiritual happiness and the liberty to pursue it. So there's not this kind of conspiracy from Rome to undermine Republican institutions. Rather, there is an overwhelming support for those institutions. And the real target for American opposition should be communist countries that are responsible for the closure of all different kinds of religious institutions and the persecution of believers, because communism was, in his regard, what he called the mystical body of the Antichrist. It had its own scriptures, it had its own saints, and he would make fun of the fact that Lenin had to be embalmed in order to look like he had immortality or eternal life. And so these were all sort of like hideous simulacra, is another term he uses, that it revealed the true evil in the heart of communism, that all Jews, Protestants, and Catholics could agree was truly evil and needed to be opposed.
So the Americanism, he wants to correct sort of a Protestant use of that term against Catholics and against other dissenting groups as they see them. He wants to use Americanism because the Vatican has condemned it, maybe without full information. And he wants ultimately to vindicate maybe a deeper understanding of liberty, but run it through the American Constitution, through the foundations of constitutional order in this country, and defend liberty in that manner.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the consequence of this was overwhelmingly successful, not just owing to the message, but also the messenger. Fulton Sheen was a man of incredible oratorical gift. He hosted a national television show in the early 1950s. You write about that in the book. That was widely lauded, which still is worth thinking about. And I think the episodes are available on YouTube. But that's right.
And he does this sort of this Americanism on the show, and frequently takes on current issues, and found a way. And you talk about also he could bring a lot of people in to the discussion that say didn't subscribe to his faith.
I have so the show was called Life is Worth Living. It won an Emmy, I want to say, in 1952, and he won an Emmy against Frank Sinatra and Milton Berle, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite stories about this is that a friend of mine who's Baptist, his father was a minister, Baptist minister, talked about how his father would watch Life is Worth Living, despite the fact that there was this papist priest on the television. No one's not supposed to watch this as a Baptist, but he would sort of write down some of the best lines from the show and use them in his own sermon. Yeah. He did have this kind of ability to draw in audiences, and that made for him to have a pretty strong platform to speak to public figures as well. He had, he was showing up at the Eisenhower White House somewhat frequently, for example.
So do you see, we started off, and you start off in your book talking about Tocqueville and the particular important place religion has in America and as a public philosophy. And then we talked about sort of the problems with that, the challenges, the violence, the refusals at first to admit certain groups. How do you see Sheen, and how do you see sort of his say Catholic intervention into Protestant hegemony? Is that working out Tocqueville, or does that sort of challenge what Tocqueville says?
So this is tough for Sheen. When he's getting started in the 30s, he's actually getting it in the ear from social gospel Protestants, like G. Bromley Oxnam, who was a Methodist bishop from the later start.
Social gospel Protestants being those who perhaps say downplayed traditional Christian beliefs in favor of social democratic or progressive uplift and a heavy focus on politics.
Precisely, sort of the development of an American state towards a kind of public welfare in which the church would be kind of an advocate, but not the state would be the dispenser.
Yeah.
And so the reason why Sheen had to deal with this was both because of the sort of prevailing anti-Catholicism among many American Protestants, despite the kind of efforts of some mainline Protestants to start a sort of new consensus and a Judeo-Christian consensus. There's this lingering anti-Catholicism among even the mainline faithful, but also because social gospelers were more interested in aligning with sort of leftist regimes in the world. And Sheen opposed intervention in Spain when the communist Republicans were fighting against the nationalists. And Sheen thought that neither side should benefit from American participation because because the communists were killing priests and the Franco types didn't seem to be all that savory either. And this is the kind of stuff that at the granular level was what Sheen had to work out. And so Sheen was frequently accused of being a kind of fascist fellow traveler, as were a lot of American priests during this time. And the way that he was able to affirm to the contrary was constantly to talk about America in these terms that established constitutional democracy as a regime that not only Catholics could sort of tolerate, but it would internalize as part of belonging to their country that they followed themselves. And so these individual sort of points, especially early in his career, were the kinds of examples where he had to kind of make the rubber meet the road. He has this great message. How is he going to prove that he actually means it? And another way that he often did this was in the form of conversions. So he was responsible for bringing communists into the Roman Catholic Church. And there's this kind of this pattern that emerges with Fulton Sheen that as he brings communists, either that some of them were actually former Catholics, who bring them into the church or they would return to the church. And then no sooner would they make this kind of conversion and they would enter into the church, he would immediately send them to the FBI for debriefing or the CIA for debriefing, where they would then be given some degree of federal protection. So you actually see in the process of Sheen's conversion, the conversions of these people, a movement from this kind of bad stuff that's bad for America, it's bad for people of conscience, and reconstituting them as good citizens. And the irony, of course, is that Fulton Sheen wins an Emmy, and Oxnam ends up hauled before a House committee to test for being a communist fellow traveler, which is a really strange moment in the book.
That part of the book is interesting for me, having written on Whittaker Chambers, because I was not aware of Sheen's role in converting some of the people who had been in Chambers' network. One of which was the blonde spy queen, Elizabeth Bentley, and also Louis Boudin's, who worked with Chambers, and Chambers refers to him several times in Witness. I wondered if Sheen or Chambers ever interacted. They had to have at some level, I would think, but
they had to have.
But I've never found any mention of that. I don't want to. I know we've got our time is our time, and we've got a lot of interesting things. Maybe we will kind of leap from Sheen in the 1950s. Maybe there's a bridge on Sheen and civil rights. You don't write that much about Sheen and civil rights. But Martin Luther King challenged. Go ahead.
Sheen on civil rights. He was in favor. He was strongly in favor of civil rights. But by the time he was speaking on this, it was on television shows that were not getting renewed, and he was more or less becoming a marginal figure in political life,
as opposed to meeting with presidents in the White House.
Yeah, by that point, he was living in a one-bedroom apartment in New York because he was on the outs of Cardinal Spellman. But read the book if you want to know more about that. There's Thomas Reed's book on Sheen. It's really good on this too.
Martin Luther King. On the Judeo-Christian consensus, tell us about King's approach through his theological idea of the blessed community.
Beloved community.
Beloved community. I'm
sorry. That's okay. I just finished writing a whole other thing on King for an edited volume coming out. So I'm like neck deep in this stuff. And
Okay.
King's fascinating on this because no sooner do you start to see like at the point at which Sheen is really at his pinnacle of influence over this Judeo-Christian consensus is in the middle of the 1950s, and it's no sooner as he sort of at that pinnacle than you start to see someone else who might also have a claim to just to preaching to this coalition of religious believers, the consensus of religious believers, and mobilizing them for some other end. And King actually makes some references to Sheen early in his career. He actually criticizes one of his books, Peace of Soul, as being insufficiently concerned with the ordinary lives of the suffering African Americans in segregated South. So there are these odd connections we find between the three cases. That's one of them. But King's idea of the Judeo-Christian, King actually used the term Hebraic Christian tradition or Hebraic Christian consensus, or it's a bit different, but it means the same thing. And his understanding was that these are all people of conscience who should not be adjusted. The term he likes to use, they should not be adjusted to segregation. And the reason that they are not is that they have sort of domesticated churches that have lost a kind of prophetic voice. And if they were to regain that prophetic voice, the one that he's trying to use to speak to the American people, what they would uncover is that there's actually in the United States this capacity for individuals to open themselves up to God's love. And this is something he gets from a lot of theology, like people like Paul Tillich, in reference to love as agape, or sacrificial love, the love of Christ on the cross. And this kind of sacrificial love in which a person sacrifices their own personal interests or well-being for the purposes of elevating the broader community, when done by everyone in that community, generates a tremendous amount of love for one another that will lead to changes in laws. And this is one of the things about King's sort of foundational view of love, which is that the conversion comes first. You have to convert yourself to this change in the heart, turn towards the cross, and see that that white supremacists need to surrender the unearned privilege they have in segregation codes. And in order for that to happen, African American and also white, sympathetic white activists had to demonstrate their willingness to love them, these segregationists, these white supremacists, by putting their bodies on the line to save their souls. And so the hope was that this would draw in attention and propagate a movement in which this openness to the cross would lead to a purification of racial hatred in the form of internal conversions among the enemies of people to King, and would ultimately introduce them into that same beloved community that he wishes to realize. And at the core of this, go ahead.
No. Just thinking here, talk about, because King also sort of runs this through the Constitution as well. Proper foundation of constitutionalism in America for King.
That's right. Yeah, at the core of this is the church. The church is supposed to bear witness and give this prophetic voice. But that tradition he has is one that he ties to the Jewish prophets, right? The famous line about "Let justice roll down like a mighty stream" comes from the book of Amos. And he would also sort of speak to specific faith traditions when speaking to them in order to count. So he'd give a line from the prophet Amos. This is all forms of recognition. He would quote Aquinas, and then maybe he might quote Paul Bunyan. And so you got your Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant positions, and then he would draw them together. Normally, the two figures he would single out are Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, principal author, and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln serves as a kind of martyr to the political implementation of the Hebraic Christian tradition in the form of freeing the slaves. But also, they're very significant figures, especially later in King's life, because they're reluctant, right? And they're imperfect. And so they don't have to become these sort of pure defenders of the Hebraic Christian tradition who have never, thought a racist thought, right? What they just had to be is they had to be good enough as statesmen to know what the right choice is and open themselves to constant improvement in the experience of God's love in their lives. So he gets harder and harder on them over the course of his life as it gets harder and harder for him to push towards any more racial justice. But that's still the connection that's there, right? You have the person who gives the Declaration of Independence, the person who defends it while defending the Constitution. And they're seen as coextensive to Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant religious faith in a way that's absolutely vital to King right up until his assassination.
This is interesting, and I remember hearing this, from the first moment I heard about King, the point of nonviolent resistance. Maybe I've grown too familiar with his arguments there, but you talk about this, that the nonviolent resistance, if one were to be violent, and who does he rule out? He rules out, on the one hand, the KKK, but he also rules out black nationalism, black militant groups as well, as a part of his group. And he wants the nonviolent resistance is the only way to forge a new public bond. If it's violent, one, there's a practical problem. The sympathy from other white Americans and from crucially white moderates won't be there. But also, forgiveness itself is the only way to forge a new bond. That's what we're thinking about.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. His line on this is good. He's inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and passive resistance and the removal of British imperialism from India. So he has this funny line. He refers to Jesus provides the message and Gandhi provided the method. And the idea is that at this moment, the proper strategy for implementing the best of the Hebraic Christian tradition is in the form of nonviolent direct action, in which the hope was that not only would the people who are persecuting the activists would take stock for themselves what they are doing. They're like, firing high pressure hoses on small children and then bombing churches but also that everyone in the United States will bear witness to this fact and have to reckon with themselves where they stand on the matter. And I mentioned earlier there are these media stories, like Sheen is able to get his own radio station and his own television show. There's a kind of funny reason for that, but he gets it. And King does not have that option for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
So he has to bring the media to him. So there's a secondary factor here where he's trying to build the beloved community by demonstrating the willingness of activists to put their bodies on the line, but also to draw in media attention to show exactly what's going on, because he has this concern that the black nationalists on the margins of the civil rights movement will grow strength increasingly if his nonviolent direct action does not succeed. And he actually, this fear that he has becomes increasingly realized as, black nationalism gains greater purchase towards the end of King's life. And it's very upsetting to him about that.
The letter from a Birmingham jail. We hear a lot about that. People bring that up from time to time. What's the essence there? He's been put in jail for violating segregation laws in Montgomery, Alabama, and proceeds to talk about the good law and an unjust law and what the citizen owes.
It's so there's a lot of really great scholarship on the history behind this. One example that I really like is a book by S. Jonathan Bass called "Blessed Are the Peacemakers." I want to say it's on my shelf over here. And there's a funny moment in the book when Bull Connor, Theophilus Bull Connor, decides to use violence against protesters, where there's actually a lot of excitement. They've been waiting for the violence, and they knew that if Bull Connor would give in to the temptation to violence, that they would ultimately sort of have on full display at this critical moment. King hasn't had a big win in desegregation in a while, and the memories of Montgomery are really fading in people's minds. And so once Connor, for his own political reasons, caves to this, there's a kind of call from seven different clergymen, white clergymen in the in Birmingham. One's a rabbi, there's a Catholic priest, and Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Episcopalian, clergy all write this letter asking for King to kind of calm down, and they make an amazing foil for King, because here's
and also don't they also say, and why is a pastor getting involved in politics?
That's right. There's this kind of in the South especially, there's this kind of don't get involved in politics attitude in the church, because that inevitably means opening up this very question.
Mm-hmm.
And
funny how that argument funny how that argument gets used in a lot of different contexts. We don't really want to deal with you. You just shouldn't be speaking. That's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean it's you can imagine like how they were in that Birmingham office, the SDLC. They're like, these guys are doing exactly what we thought they would do, right? Finally, like everything is sort of coming according to plan. So at this moment, this critical moment for King, he has got to get this right. He has got to get this letter right. And so he not only is he addressing the clergymen in the letter, like something that gets overlooked is that he's actually writing to them. Right. Of course, he doesn't send them the letter by themselves. Right. It gets into every newspaper they can possibly get to print it. But also he's addressing their congregations. He's addressing Americans as peoples of faith, and as well as clergymen to know where to sort of justify this stance on ignoring the plight of African Americans. And the pictures that you see of like the water hoses and dogs, that emerge from this really have a galvanizing effect on the broader country to respond. As I mentioned in the book, and there's a lot of really great work on this. Like the one person that doesn't galvanize is John F. Kennedy, who's obviously dealing with a lot of things in the White House. But after Birmingham, King becomes this force that cannot be ignored and really cannot be stopped. And the letter from Birmingham jail is crafted. It was like, him in jail and with like people in his office sort of taking drafts back and forth. And at this critical moment in history, they got it exactly right. So it's this deservedly lauded piece of English rhetoric that should be studied and read by everyone, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, Jerry Falwell took the line. Not necessarily a racist line, but the line that pastors like King should stay out of politics. That's your next figure
mm-hmm.
here. And I'll ask the question.
That's right.
I mean, we could ask the question about all three figures, why you chose them. But why specifically did you choose Jerry Falwell to be a part of this book?
That's good. I mean, when I wanted to pick Sheen, and I wasn't sure. Actually, I ended up picking Sheen because my mom encouraged me to do so. Originally, I had and that's because my mom was sort of converted to Catholicism in part by Fulton Sheen by watching his show. So, thanks, Mom. But he's also kind of understudied. Usually people, and I blame the prominence of Jesuit education in this country. I'm kidding. But they tend to go for John Courtney Murray, right? But Sheen actually had much more of a presence in the United States than Murray did. And King, I think, is pretty obvious. But Falwell is a bit more contentious. In fact, John Shields at Claremont McKenna likes to, at least about 10 years ago, published a book sort of downplaying Falwell. And the reason for downplaying Falwell was both because Falwell was at that 10 or 15 years ago was at the end of his life, at the end of his political his sort of political power, but also like American Protestants wanted to get past this stuff. They wanted to get past the moral majority and sort of renew a message. Mm-hmm. And the reason that was given sort of in scholarly terms was that Falwell seemed to have less of an influence in the moral majority than observers in the 1970s and 80s thought he did. And my argument in the book is that if you go by like sort of social science methods, it's sort of true that he didn't have as much of an influence, but that's partly because the social science at the time is trying to pull people back from thinking that Jerry Falwell is the real president behind Ronald Reagan. There's sort of a textual problem there when we go back and look at this literature. But also because the most significant thing that Falwell did is he broke the taboo. He was the one who decided that the separatism of independent and Southern Baptist churches was no longer doing good for the country. Baptists were part of that fundamentalist exile from politics, an exile that's kind of been overstated. There's been some really great work sort of explaining that they never quite leave.
But conventionally seen to start with the end of the Scopes trial and sort of a pullback from that point forward. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. And also the disaffection from the failure of prohibition. And so they have a kind of skepticism about participation in government because what it seems to do is corrupt the church. And they would rather the United States sort of go into the inevitable decline that all states do when they cease to adhere to the gospel, provided that they can save enough souls in the meantime. And Falwell's big break on this is we can't save souls if America ceases to exist. So he explains that it is necessary to preserve the regime if the church is going to save souls before the end times or the apocalypse in Revelation.
Now you
this is like the last full measure of the church.
You also say the Judeo-Christian consensus ends with Falwell. Talk about that.
Yes. So what happens during the period between King, when he's assassinated in 68, and the rise of Falwell is an interval of 10 years. And some folks will say, well, that was a big 10 years, right? That was after 68, you have the kind of student revolt, you have the rise of the New Left, and the sort of advancement of a kind of secular politics, and especially sort of more sort of aggressively socialist politics, which King was sort of experimented with, especially towards the end of his life. And the response that could have been made then would be for reckonings that churches would make with that. But instead with Falwell, what you get is an effort to repurpose the Judeo-Christian consensus from a shared consensus under context from this secular worldview. And instead, there's this effort, especially with people who supported this in the formation of the moral majority, to move that Judeo-Christian consensus into a constituency for the Republican Party. And that's effectively what the moral majority was for. When you look at Sheen, and when he meets with public figures, he's meeting with Nixon and he's meeting with, Fiorello LaGuardia, right? He's meeting with all different kinds of people. King was careful. He liked to meet with sympathetic Republicans and Democrats, although he would weigh in a little bit more, especially during the 64 campaign between Johnson and Goldwater. But he was always open to anyone who was willing to sponsor civil rights legislation because he needed all the help he can get. And Falwell was a bit more regimented in what he was willing to accept. He defined himself as a conservative, associated himself with the new conservative movement, and was trying to bring as many people from within these churches as possible into the Republican Party as constituents who would be mobilized as a voter base that would overwhelmingly turn out to vote to produce Republican majorities that would roll back the 10 years that had elapsed between 68 to 78, 78 being the year that Falwell really becomes part of politics.
So we think about this Tocquevillian notion or norm that we started with: spirit of religion, spirit of liberty, working together, strengthening one another, enlarging one another. And then the way you sort of in the book, and maybe I read it wrong, is that's been challenged. A religion and liberty are no longer seen as certainly there's profound tension, but now are hostile to one another. Falwell is seen because of the way in which he focused in a very partisan way of putting religion both in the service of conservatism and in the service of the Republican Party, sort of signals the end of that. And then I guess that opens the question, though, where are we now with regard to religion in the public square?
Yeah, so I don't know how you could have read it wrong. There's this line here, rather than find a new way to speak to all Americans indirectly, the clergy found themselves speaking to a shrinking number of stakeholders, campaign staffers, and elected officials interested less in the gospel or Torah and more towards donations, voter registration, and campaign volunteers. I don't think you read that wrong. That is
No,
very much
I
the
remember
position
that line clearly. I remember that. Now, did you find it interesting in the 2016 campaign that Liberty University and Jerry Falwell Jr. seemed to be legitimating influences for Donald Trump within religious conservatism?
Yeah.
Or a certain kind. I mean, the irony there was rich, I thought, right down to posing with Trump in front of a Playboy framed.
A Playboy magazine.
Yeah.
So I plant this flag a little bit at the end of the Falwell chapter. I didn't want to be too Trump focused in the book, especially because much of this book was, put together without ever thinking that he would go down that fateful staircase or escalator, I guess it was. But I do have this kind of paragraph where I mention that the Nehemiad, which is a big part of Falwell's message. I should mention this. The Nehemiad refers to taking the narrative of the pious governor, that is Nehemiah in the Bible, and applying it to public figures. It's actually a very old idea. It's one that stems all the way back from the Puritan founding. There's the whole concept of the American Nehemiah. Originally, that was John Winthrop. The title gets applied to George Washington. I have articles about this that I've published, like the one in Journal and Church and State. And I actually learned of this by looking at Falwell's sermons, in which he talks endlessly about Nehemiah. And normally when people talk about American Protestant narratives, they talk about the Jeremiad. And Falwell uses it, but not really as the centerpiece. What he's talking instead about the rise of a pious governor, in this case a pious president, who will rebuild the walls, right? Essentially bring back the ethical guards that America needs in order to preserve its fate against the end time.
Okay.
And the person who returns to that image is Robert Jeffress, who is the pastor that gave his sermon right before Trump's inauguration.
Baptist pastor from Dallas, Texas.
Yeah.
Who many of our listeners have probably seen on TV. Yeah, TV a number of times. Yeah, okay.
And there's, for those who are, I actually like that. There's only like a little paragraph that raises this. It's like
that was on Trump's inauguration day. He gave that. That's right. Sermon.
And I wrote that paragraph, and I wanted to say more about it, but it didn't fit in the book, so I submitted a piece to Law and Liberty, which they connected.
Yeah.
So, which you took. So, you can see an extended discussion of that. The Nehemiah is very much part of this, and Trump's attachment to this old sort of Falwellian Nehemiah is sort of part of this legacy of the sort of decreasing constituencies that are part of what we could call the Judeo-Christian consensus.
Now, we know about, the kind of in this moment we're in. I mean, we had the Obama administration. We had some pretty strong stances, I think, being taken against what we thought were conventional, I'll say bipartisan positions on religious liberty. One thinks of the Hosanna Tabor case, where the Obama administration seemed to argue against there even being a ministerial exception to civil rights laws. Thus, the federal government would be able to pick your pastor. Theoretically, if that argument had prevailed at the Supreme Court, it was slammed 9-0. Also, think about the contraceptive mandate, and there's just a lot of flashpoints. And then also, so we all kind of get the picture now of a pretty strident opposition in this country, and it's very partisan on behalf of what religious liberty is and what's going to be defined. And when we hear you say, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama also will defend, they say, freedom of worship, which is very constricted. That's just what you do inside your church or your synagogue or whatever. And so we still have this position out there that's defended primarily by conservatives, by Republicans, conservative lawyers, and that's sort of where we are now with regards to religious liberty. It's very contentious, and one group that you've written about, and we've published a number of pieces on Law and Liberty, associated in certain ways with the journal called First Things, which itself is ironic, have sort of repudiated or said the sort of defense of religious liberty itself is no longer valid. That was prominently put forward by, say, Father Richard Newhouse, the late Father Newhouse, George Weigel, others in the pages of First Things. This no longer really works. Religious freedom doesn't really exist. It can't really be defended. What could be done is something called integralism. Adrian Vermeule, an endowed chair at Harvard Law School, prominently defended this. Gladden Papin as well. We see some from Matthew
Right.
Schmitz, number 2 editor at First Things. Talk about that and how you see that playing out, if making any impact.
Well, so I'm very grateful you have not stated my Twitter handle at this point, because integralism is sort of I was first actually introduced to in its modern form through Twitter, and so what integralism amounts to is, and I wrote about this in Law and Liberty, is that there's a kind of despairing of the liberal democratic order. Deneen sort of was the first step in this by Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, sort of explaining how liberalism is fundamentally incompatible with Catholicism. He does so.
Let me read, just for our listeners, I want to read this and then get your comment. You say, early in the book, and you're referring to Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. Liberalism, you say, is not the cause of the problems Deneen observes, since ideas lack agency. Rather, one of the most important defenses against the excesses of American liberalism, religious institutions failed to remain independent of politics. In short, liberalism did not fail the church. The church failed liberalism, end quote.
Yeah, which I'm sure is a line that integralists will holler at, because it is quite a statement. But I guess if I were to pivot to talk about that quotation, it would be that with the decline of the Judeo-Christian consensus from a kind of generally shared set of values across a broad population to a diminished constituency of the Republican Party, what you saw with it was the compromise of the idea of the church as an authority that did not participate in politics, but instead indirectly supported democratic regimes by instilling in people a sense of a shared dogma, of the need for virtue, and ultimately to prioritize spiritual salvation over material goods. And that is what the role of religion has always supposed to be in a regime like the United States. So what you end up with at the end of the Judeo-Christian consensus are weak churches. You get weak churches, people who are clergy who are unable to speak to a faithful, that see clergy as either reactionaries or politically compromised or partisan. You have sorting in churches. There are churches that will have different people with different kinds of beliefs, and they won't go to another church. They won't go to another denomination. And so the extension of politics into the church led to the rivalry in the United States between the Party of Liberty, the Democratic Party, sort of what could be, critics would call the Party of License, right? Or the Party of Religion, which critics would call the sort of Party of reactionary medievalists. And integralists have sort of adopted that kind of way of thinking, which is that let's be reactionaries, right? Let's actually establish a church in the United States and impose its moral standards directly, since churches themselves are too weak to do so anymore. And that imposition will be productive of virtue. And in some cases, like, I've seen, unless I'm reading him wrong, like Pater Edmund Waldstein actually refers to this kind of use of state coercion as not violence but mercy. This is sort of this need to bring people into correction, and that is ultimately the direction integralists want to go. Is to do away with the separation of church and state in the United States, because it was productive of this secularizing regime, and instead seize control of the administrative state for the purposes of the church. And this is what Adrian Vermeule, you mentioned earlier, refers to as rally mall. Or essentially the sort of Catholic equivalent of the march across the institution. Yeah. And that is definitely not a position that I ever expected to encounter in my adult life.
Yeah, no. And so it would seem, and just thinking about this, you say the church failed liberalism, and thinking about the rise of, say, integralism. It's also the case the church failed liberalism. The liberalism itself never made churches in America sort of reduce themselves or create as many problems as they have created for themselves. And in particular, you think about the Catholic Church. You and I are both Catholic, looking at the sex abuse crisis, which has we don't even realize the fallout from that yet. Here we are, 2019, First big news of this was in 2002. So, I mean, I guess in a way, it's like liberalism, to my mind, itself is not the problem. It may just be, maybe this is what we're kind of tripping over ourselves. We're just saying religion itself is posing its own problem to itself. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
The introduction of the book actually talks about the sort of the specific scholarly problem with this discussion of liberalism. And Sam Goldman wrote a review of why liberalism failed that I think is the review. It is just perfect and isolating how. I mean, the book's great. I have to say I like the book, but and a lot of the criticisms that he offers of liberalism. But one of the key weaknesses to Deneen's text is that liberalism serves as a kind of agent. And that's what I mean in that quotation about ideas do not do things like people do. They're historical contingencies. And this is an argument that I actually drew from Goldman's review. And so the idea that ideas are agents of political change on their own, the sort of like disembodied Geist, or what Goldman calls the Geist, from sort of treating this as a Hegelian theory, is that it becomes liberalism becomes a kind of demiurge, right? It's this sort of like evil spirit. Yeah. And so, and in order to deal with it, we have to summon the good spirit of integralism. And so they have this weird existential fight that leads to people saying, sometimes ironically, that in the future integralist state, this problem or that problem will not exist because somehow it will be destroyed by some sort of spiritual entity that will defeat liberalism, the cause for all of our problems. And that sort of speaks to the problem of a weak church, right? People do not think the church speaks to them or deals with moral problems in a prophetic way. It also speaks to a kind of isolation that they cannot account for why things are the way they are in their lives, and so they look to these kinds of like Gnostic battles between lightness and darkness, and that's that kind of isolation is something that Tocqueville promised would surface in the United States in the absence of strong churches bringing people together in communities
and families and communities. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, my approach is not an integralist approach. It's to say, well, how do we find ways to rearticulate why we limited government in the first place, and why did we want robust communities in the first place? And it wasn't just choice for the sake of choice, or to define yourself however you want, but to try and, as something Sheen and we talked about in this interview, the attempt to know the truth about yourself. And it seems to me those things have to be re-articulated. James Patterson, thank you so much for joining us and discussing your new book, Religion in the Public Square.
It was an honor.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.